You think you know Henry VIII, the king with 6 wives, the tyrant who turned marriage into execution. But you've never stepped into his bedroom, the most terrifying courtroom in England. Because in Tudor England, the royal bed wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a theatre of power, a sacrificial altar, and sometimes a crime scene. From the moment Henry VIII took his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, every royal wedding night was not an act of love, it was an act of proof. Proof that the king could perform, proof that the queen could conceive, and proof that God still favored the Tudor bloodline. The truth, every wedding night, was a public trial. The sheets, the sounds, the sweat, all of it became evidence. When the candles in the royal chamber went dark, the courtiers outside would lean close to the door. They weren't praying, they were listening, waiting to hear the creak of bedposts, the whispered gasps, the muffled moans that meant England would live another day. Because at dawn, the inspection began. Servants would carry the royal sheets out as if they were holy relics. Physicians examined them like detectives searching for blood. Even the queen's body wasn't hers anymore. It was state property. Her skin, her purity, her ability to bleed on command, all measured and recorded. If the evidence was lacking, if the stains weren't too convincing enough, panic spread through the court. Maybe the king was impotent. Maybe the queen was bewitched. Maybe the marriage itself had angered God. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first queen, knew this dread too well. She spent her youth under the constant shadow of inspection. After her first wedding night with Henry's brother Arthur, the court demanded proof of her virginity again. When she married Henry years later, she was examined by royal physicians like an accused criminal trying to prove her innocence. That was Henry's England, a world where intimacy was political, and failure in bed could mean exile, annulment, or worse, execution. And if you think that's horrific, wait until you hear the next rule. Because in Henry's bedroom, saying no was a crime punishable by death. Rule 2, no refusal allowed. Once the door closed, the queen was no longer a woman. She was a subject. Henry, convinced that his will was divine, believed that disobedience in bed was treason against God himself. If he called for her, she had to come, no matter the hour, no matter the condition of his body. And by the end of his life, that body had become a nightmare. Historical records describe a king so massive he could barely walk, his legs swollen with ulcers that dripped pus through the night. The stench of infection was so thick that even his servants gagged when changing his linens. Yet the queen was expected to lie beside him, to breathe him in, to act as if she adored him. Anne of Cleves, the 4th wife, was said to hold her breath when he touched her. Catherine Parr used perfumed handkerchiefs to mask the smell. But refusal, impossible. Even hesitation could spark an accusation of witchcraft, adultery, or treason. Henry's spies were everywhere. His chamberlains reported how quickly a queen answered his summons, how long she stayed, whether she smiled, whether her steps sounded eager. It wasn't just paranoia. It was a system, a monarchy built on fear, where affection was monitored like espionage, and where the punishment for reluctance could be the Tower of London. Modern psychologists would call it coercive control, psychological imprisonment, abuse dressed as duty. But in Henry's court, it was just another night. One historian wrote that the Tudor bedchamber was the most dangerous room in England, because love could never exist where obedience was law. As the candles burned low and the courtiers whispered prayers outside the door, the Queen of England would lie still, half terrified, half numb, knowing that even her silence could be recorded as evidence. And by sunrise, her fate could already be sealed, because in Henry's world, the bed was the battlefield, and the king never lost a war. The Tudor bedroom, a stage where desire, religion, and tyranny intertwined, was only just beginning its nightmare performance. Next came the most disturbing rule of all. The body itself became evidence of loyalty. By now, the Tudor bedroom was no longer a private place. It was a courtroom wrapped in velvet, with the bed as the witness stand. The next rule turned flesh into confession. The body itself became evidence. In Henry VIII's court, fertility was not just a divine blessing, it was the measure of political survival. When a queen failed to conceive, suspicion didn't fall on the king. It fell on her. If Henry struggled to perform, his courtiers whispered that the queen must have bewitched him, cursed his body, or poisoned his blood. Because in Tudor logic, a king chosen by God could not possibly fail as a man. So when his power faltered in bed, someone else had to be blamed. Royal physicians were summoned to investigate. They examined both king and queen after intimate nights, recording their findings as though they were mapping treason. Every blemish, scar, and birthmark could be interpreted as a witch's mark. Even the curve of a woman's body could become a weapon used against her. When Henry married Anne of Cleves, their wedding night was a disaster. He claimed she was so repulsive that his body refused her. In truth, he likely suffered from severe impotence, worsened by diabetes and infection. But to admit that would be to admit weakness. So he called her a Flanders mare and declared their marriage unconsummated. The marriage was annulled, not because she failed him, but because his pride demanded it. Then came Catherine Howard, young, radiant, full of life, and doomed. When Henry's passion cooled, he accused her of witchcraft and infidelity, claiming her youth had somehow corrupted his soul. She would die under the blade, her body literally becoming the evidence of his failure. To live as Henry's wife was to live under constant inspection, both spiritual and physical. The same court that toasted you as queen today could dissect you like a specimen tomorrow. And privacy, that was a foreign concept, because the next rule in Henry's twisted book stripped even that away. Rule 4, guards at the door. The king's chamber was never empty. Even when the door was locked, ears were listening. Guards stationed outside were tasked with recording the sounds of the royal bed, how long the king lasted, what noises were heard, even the silence between movements. Servants would later report whether the queen appeared flushed or pale the next morning. These details were written into the archives of England as if they were matters of state, because they were. At Hampton Court and Whitehall, the royal apartments were built like fortresses of observation. Corridors bent sharply to conceal hidden doorways. Peepholes were installed behind carved wooden panels, allowing spies to glimpse the royal couple in bed. A queen could never be certain if she was truly alone, or if unseen eyes were judging her through candlelight. Historians have found accounts from chamber servants describing the watch nights, evenings, when guards were ordered to remain awake, waiting for the sounds of duty being fulfilled. They were told to mark the time, to ensure that the king's vigor was known to the court. It wasn't protection, it was surveillance. Imagine being an Anne Boleyn, brilliant, ambitious, and now trapped in a world where every sigh, every shift of the mattress, was a matter of politics. Her rivals whispered that she bewitched Henry through seduction. Her own charm became her execution warrant. When her fortunes turned, even her laughter in the bedchamber was reinterpreted as mockery of the king. She, too, would meet the axe, her evidence erased by the swing of a blade. For Henry, control was never enough. He needed proof of control. The act of watching, of recording, of transforming intimacy into documentation, that was his power. It was monarchy reduced to anatomy. The divine right of kings measured by the sounds of flesh. The bedroom walls absorbed it all, the whispers, the prayers, the cries that could not be spoken aloud. And every sound carried through the corridors, out into the gossiping halls of power, where ministers and courtiers traded rumors like currency. To live as Henry's queen was to live in constant performance, a prisoner forced to smile, breathe, and move, as others judged from the shadows. The bedroom was no longer a sanctuary. It was an open stage, and every heartbeat was a line in a deadly play. By the time dawn broke over Hampton Court, even the walls seemed to exhale the stench of fear. For queens of England, sleep offered no escape. Even dreams were dangerous, because servants were told to report what the queen muttered in her sleep, as if nightmares themselves might reveal treason. And the pressure was only growing, because for all the humiliation, for all the surveillance, there was still one sacred duty that every queen had to perform, and failure meant the end of her life. Her duty was to conceive. The king demanded a son, the court demanded an heir, and God, they said, demanded proof of divine favor. The royal bed would now become an altar to fertility, and for Henry's wives, that altar was soaked in blood and tears. In Henry's England, the marriage bed was no longer about affection, it was about production. Every time the queen lay beside her husband, it was not to rest, it was to create. And if she failed to conceive, the whispers began immediately. Was she cursed? Was she impure? Or was God punishing England itself? Rule 5. Pregnancy as a duty. For the queens of Henry VIII, pregnancy wasn't a private hope, it was a royal command. The Tudor court treated the womb like a national treasure, guarded and monitored as if England's future was sealed inside it. Royal physicians tracked menstrual cycles with crude calendars, priests prayed over pillows, and midwives whispered superstitions passed down from pagan times. Catherine of Aragon knew this agony better than anyone. She conceived 6 times, only 1 child survived. Each stillbirth was announced to the court like a state tragedy. When she miscarried, Henry blamed her, claiming she'd offended heaven. What the world saw as heartbreak, Henry saw as failure. And failure, in his eyes, had to be replaced. Anne Boleyn would follow her into the same nightmare. The court celebrated when she became pregnant, convinced she carried a son. But when her baby was born, a girl Elizabeth Henry's warmth turned cold overnight. Subsequent miscarriages sealed her fate. Even her dreams became suspect. Chroniclers recorded that Anne once spoke of a dark-winged thing that perched on her bedpost. Whether it was superstition or despair, Henry took it as an omen. Within months, she was accused of adultery and witchcraft. Her motherhood turned into her execution motive. For queens, pleasure was forbidden, pain was mandatory, and fertility was their only armor. They were forbidden from eating certain foods, no cold fruits, no sour wine. They were fed boiled herbs, deer marrow, and even powdered pearls to warm the womb. The kitchens of Hampton Court smelled not of feasts, but of medicinal potions brewed for conception. But these rituals were nothing compared to the dread that came when a queen failed to deliver. Because once she fell from favor, the bed itself transformed from cradle to coffin. Rule 6. The danger of falling out of favor. To lose Henry's affection was to lose your life. The same bed that witnessed the king's passion could, days later, become the prelude to an execution warrant. Anne Boleyn's decline began in that very chamber. Henry, plagued by insomnia and festering wounds, grew paranoid that his wife was plotting against him through charms of the flesh. His courtiers, eager to please, twisted every gesture of hers into evidence. A smile became seduction. A tear became manipulation. And then there was Catherine Howard, the teenage queen, who thought her beauty could soothe the monster. Henry adored her at first, calling her his rose without thorn. But behind the silken laughter was a terrified child forced to serve a decaying king. When rumors surfaced of her past, Henry's affection evaporated. He continued to summon her to bed, even as her execution was being arranged. Imagine that, a girl trembling in his arms, knowing each kiss brought her closer to death. The royal bed had become a stage for psychological torture. Henry no longer sought intimacy, he sought confession. "Do you love me?" he would ask, as if love could save her from the axe. Every answer was wrong. Silence meant guilt. Too much affection meant deceit. What began as passion always ended with the scrape of a sword. But as horrific as this was, there was still one more rule, one that turned Henry's bedroom into something far worse than a chamber of fear. It became a chamber of rot. Rule 7. The stench of disease. By his later years, Henry VIII was a corpse that refused to die. Once athletic and golden-haired, he had ballooned into a 400-pound mass of infected flesh. His legs were wrapped in bandages that leaked pus so foul that servants fainted. The bed linens had to be burned every week because the smell of decay couldn't be scrubbed out, and yet queens were expected to lie beside him. Catherine Parr, his final wife, used perfumed sachets under her nose just to endure the nights. Servants sprinkled rosewater on the floor. Priests burned incense until the air was thick with smoke. Still, the stench clung to everything. One account claimed the smell reached the far corridors before dawn. Henry's ulcers weren't just painful, they were symbolic. His body mirrored his kingdom, diseased, decaying, and rotting from within, but no one dared speak of it. To suggest the king was unwell was treason. So the court smiled, feigned admiration, and whispered their disgust only when doors were locked. Even his physicians were terrified. They drained his wounds daily, the pus flowing into silver bowls. And yet, he continued to summon his wife to his chamber. The king must not be refused, they said, but to approach him was to inhale death itself. Modern doctors believe Henry suffered from diabetes, osteomyelitis, and chronic infection. His body, racked with fever, may have produced hallucinations, visions of betrayal, of wives laughing at his weakness. Perhaps that explains his madness, perhaps not. But what we know is this: by his final years, the royal bedchamber reeked of disease and paranoia in equal measure. Every night the candles burned low, the sheets rustled, and somewhere, in that suffocating darkness, another queen prayed for dawn. Because in Henry's court, even sunrise could be deadly. By Henry's final decade, the palace corridors had turned silent, not out of peace, but out of terror. Every creak of a floorboard, every whisper behind a curtain, might belong to one of the king's spies. because in his England the last rule was the most lethal of all. Rule 8. Fear of accusations. It wasn't enough for a queen to survive Henry's temper, his disease, or his touch. She had to survive the rumors. Henry's court was a living organism. Gossip was its bloodstream. Every servant, guard, and lady-in-waiting was part of a surveillance web so intricate that no secret was ever safe. The smallest comment could spark an inquiry, and an inquiry could become a trial. When Anne Boleyn fell, it wasn't because of what she did, but what people said she did. The musicians she smiled at were tortured until they confessed to adultery. Her own brother, George, was accused of incest simply because he spoke too freely in her defense. No one truly believed the charges, not even Henry. But belief didn't matter. Control did. Catherine Howard met the same fate. Her past lovers were dragged before the council, interrogated, and broken under the rack until they admitted to sins they never committed. The fact that she was barely more than a girl didn't save her. In the king's mind, purity was not innocence. It was evidence waiting to rot. Inside Hampton Court, maids whispered prayers as they scrubbed the floor, terrified that a dropped word might be twisted into treason. Servants were questioned about what they saw in the Queen's chamber: the shape of a smile, the way a hand lingered on a curtain, a gown worn twice in 1 week. These details filled the ledgers of spies like Thomas Cromwell, who turned rumor into royal decree. It was a kingdom built on listening, on watching, on fear. Even the walls seemed alive with secrets. The Queen's sigh in the night could echo into the wrong ear, and by morning her name would be spoken in the council room beside a death warrant. And Henry, bloated, paranoid, festering, believed it all. He had transformed intimacy into interrogation, affection into surveillance. The act of love itself had become evidence. Even silence could be guilt. In this world, no one was innocent. Not truly. Even the Queen's body, once worshipped as sacred, now stood as potential proof of betrayal. To be loved by Henry VIII was to be studied, dissected, and ultimately destroyed. When Catherine Parr, his last wife, married him, she was not naive. She had seen the ghosts of those who came before her. Every gown she wore had once belonged to a dead queen. She survived not through passion, but through calculation. She read scripture to him at night, soothed his pain with gentle words, and masked her revulsion with grace. She knew the price of speaking out. She knew the smell of death that hung around his bed. And she learned one rule above all others: to survive, one must never be noticed too much. By the end, Henry's bedchamber was no longer a room of life. It was a mausoleum draped in gold. Every embroidered sheet, every gilded candle holder, every perfumed curtain covered the stench of decay, physical, moral, and divine. The once golden King of England, who broke a nation for love, now lay rotting in his own creation, a throne of flesh and fear. He had demanded absolute obedience, but in doing so, he destroyed the very thing he craved: love that was real, love freely given. What remained was performance, hollow, trembling, and watched by eyes that never closed. By the time Henry VIII died in 1547, the walls of his chamber were said to have turned black from years of smoke, infection, and prayer. The servants who cleaned it refused to enter alone. Some swore that on quiet nights they could still hear the echo of his cane striking the floor, or the faint groan of the bed that had borne witness to so much death. The bed that crowned queens, that condemned them, that tested faith and birthed fear. That bed was dismantled after his death. No record survives of what became of it. Perhaps it was burned. Perhaps it still stands somewhere, hidden in the bones of an English manor, holding the weight of ghosts. Because that was Henry's legacy: a monarchy where power replaced tenderness, where fear outlived love. A man who divided a nation in the name of passion, but ended surrounded by silence, unloved, unholy, and utterly alone. So when we speak of Henry VIII, remember, his cruelty didn't begin at the scaffold. It began in his bed.